I'm asked frequently which Smash Bros. Installment is my favorite, and which is my least favorite. It isn't an easy question, because each game does different things right and wrong. So instead of just saying something like Smash 4, the original, so on, and basing it on my preferences, I'm going to look at some of the key traits of the franchise and evaluate how I feel each game did using game theory. The theorems of games, actual game theory and principles, not whether Peach's boobs are real or not. I guess you could call it a side analysis, or a successor to the defining traits video I made for Mega Man, but on its side in a sense. Before we break it down, I should describe how I view Smash Bros. Because it will color how I view the games. Smash Bros. Is a colorful, moderately fast-paced Nintendo fighting crossover featuring Nintendo's best and other iconic video game characters. The series has been intent to find its own path by focusing on the whimsical aspect of many of Nintendo's franchises and forming a twist of the fighting genre, so anybody can learn to play, but only about a third can truly master. It is this large upper tier that separates the series as a fighter based around having fun, and in some cases competitive matches, but never purely competitive matches in a way that can be simplified into a science. Since I believe Smash Bros. Separates itself by being whimsical and colorful, the atmosphere and visual aesthetic should be more colorful and not overly serious. Since the game is reasonably fast-paced, one of the most vital things is that it should be easy to instantly discern what is going on at a glance. There should be few moments where a player loses track of their character. At its core, a player should be able to squint and still be able to make out most of the major shapes and colors. A smart designer knows how to use complex lighting, shaders, and filters. A wise designer knows when to restrain himself, and when to focus more on mood. This is not to say a game or level that goes against these principles is inherently bad. Indeed, if a designer is trying to have a game or level be more artistic, it is not important the player can read every change on screen, but the designer will know gameplay should be slower and less demanding during parts focused heavily on conveying a certain look, mood, or emotion. These same principles also apply for film. Fast action-packed scenes should usually be more focused on readability than getting the right look to a scene. Obviously there are always exceptions, for example if the director or designer wants to convey a feeling of being lost or overwhelmed. The methods to achieve easy readability usually are focused heavily on contrast and saturation, though they are sometimes called other things, or are grouped with other attributes of an image to be changed, simultaneously. The simplest description of what contrast is the difference between the brightest point and the darkest point of an image, or the range used for shading. If you've seen a color map or spectrum like this, contrast is the vertical axis. So if it increases, whites become whiter, and blacks become blacker. High contrast is especially important for palettes that tend to either the top or bottom, light or dark palettes. Images with low contrast can look muted or muddy, having very little difference between the lightest and darkest shade. Saturation can be thought of as the difference between color and gray, or neutral, which is a little clunky to say. If contrast is the vertical axis, saturation is mostly the horizontal axis. Increasing saturation increases the range of colors between neutral and non-neutral. In a sense, it is the second contrast. Both make it easier to identify things at a glance. Of course, there's more to it than just contrast and saturation. Too much can be overwhelming or off-putting. Regarding Smash Bros. With its diverse roster and array of items, it does come down a lot to contrast. Simpler games and concepts can choose colors that are complementary or opposite on the color wheel, which makes them stand out more. This was very often taken into account when designing NES heroes and their worlds. The original probably takes this for the simple fact it was on the N64 with the simplest of shaders available. Simply creating the characters as they appeared gave a good contrast on most stages. Melee remained very colorful, but had more instances of less saturation. Contrast generally remained high, and several stages smartly made the background brighter and less colorful to contrast with the more colorful characters in the actual stage. This can be seen in Yoshi's story particularly. Greater lighting effects added some minor issues with a few stages, however. For example, certain characters could easily blend in with the Brinstar Death stage and background, depending on the size of the TV, its picture configuration, and the location of certain characters on the stage. Brawl in this respect has some issues. The game seems to have a filter running over it to decrease the saturation and contrast. Probably because that's what Nintendo thought made their games edgy and realistic during the Wii era. If you compare assets that migrated to Smash Bros. 4, they are noticeably more colorful with a wider range of shades in Smash Bros. 4. This is for me the biggest flaw with Brawl. Some stages are still very colorful with good contrast, like Mario Circuit and the pirate ship, but others are low contrast and have other issues. Bridge of Eldin, for example, adds a reddish hue to everything on top of having low contrast, an issue somewhat rectified in its Wii U return. New Pork City could have better contrast, but its biggest problem visually is its busy background full of small details behind a mess of platforms that makes it look like the stage designer put no thought into creating it, with platforms that lead to nowhere and are not advantageous. Considering the game was only standard definition, keeping track of your character in a heated 4-person match is nearly impossible. If the contrast was increased on New Pork City, it probably would have made this issue worse actually. New Pork City needed to have a similar treatment as Yoshi's Story done to the background, and characters with higher contrast and more color. Look at Mario's shirt. Mario's shirt is deep red, not this Assassin's Creed gritty Batman voiced red. Sakurai got the Shy Guys right, but the actual characters are usually muted. Brawl at least had the sense of dramatically slowing the game down though. Smash Bros. 4 is a bit of a mixed bag. True, the returning problem stages usually have better contrast or better foreground-background separation, but others like Mario Circuit actually have slightly lower contrast and saturation. It seems a lot more like a consistent look was gone for, which resulted in the visuals meeting somewhere in the middle and being consistent in contrast and saturation. The game also has going for it full high definition, which would have done Brawl a big favor, even if not magically fixing its issues. Overall, Smash 4 is very smart about emphasizing the foreground and muting busy backgrounds. In my opinion, that smart background muting places Smash Bros. 4 just beyond the original in this respect. Considering few characters are ever lost between installments, there is little opinion that Melee is better than the original. Brawl is better than Melee, and Smash Bros. 4 is better than Brawl, regarding the roster. Although if we were talking representation, I think Brawl would barely push Smash 4 out for first. In a sense, this is a throwaway point because more characters will almost always make a better roster, but it will still affect which game you favor more. If you know me, you know I will refuse to play if anybody wants items off in Final Destination. It removes a lot of skill to have perfectly flat terrain, and when you turn off items, there's no skill left to playing, and the game becomes incredibly unbalanced. I find stages with hills and slopes to be the ones that require the most skill in strategizing and balancing the brawler versus shooter divide. Plus they're more aesthetically pleasing than Battlefield clones. You know, hey, let's get the right background and atmosphere and toss a few flat platforms in, they're done. I also don't enjoy most scrolling stages. Simplifying to flat versus sloped really isn't enough. The key thing is stages should have defensive positions as well as offensive positions. A player should have the option to take a defensive position and seek more advantageous terrain in an attempt to turn the tide without only running and evading. Hyrule Castle has the ground separated into levels as well as the tower you can enter, both of which are advantageous to have in different situations. A player hugging behind the fin of the Great Fox has a bit of cover that gives them a brief advantage over an offensive player. Blocks in Yoshi's Island are ideal places to position yourself to reduce the chance of being star-code. The Temple's Caverns have a position that reduces your chances of being code, while giving you an advantageous position to KO an opponent who approaches your position from either direction. Brinstar Depths can shift in ways that make certain locations difficult for certain characters to reach. It could turn the tide of a battle if you take that position. Foresight is separated in such a way that you can force an opponent to pursue you, allowing you a chance to prepare yourself to counter. Any stage with pits in the middle can reward players who master spike codes. Mario Galaxy, as wonky and inconsistent as the physics are, can reward being able to know how gravity will affect everything. Pilot Wings' shifting stage can cause poorly planned projectiles to fly off harmlessly. Knowing how the hazards work gives the player the advantage of being able to use them to KO or damage an opponent. Battlefield loses all of the tactical gameplay. The thin platforms even create issues that give the ground floor a bigger advantage than usual. In my opinion, Melee has the best stages, followed by the original, and then Smash Bros. 4. Similar to the roster, more music is usually better, although each game has a few tracks that are annoying or grating, like the terrible things they did to Butter Building. Sharing music, allowing you to use any song for the menu music, or allowing a small pool of music on custom stages, would be the only places a game could get an edge with less music, but there's been very little sharing. Each installment in the franchise has a slightly different feel. Some feel slow and weightless, others fast and heavy. The original is one of two that could take the title of the fastest version. It's a unique beast in that walking, running, and fall speed are all relatively slow. But most attacks and dodges are lightning fast. Landing cancels are also a major mechanic, and the speed of launches are fast. Even at 100%, it is usually past time to use your finishers to get a KO. Possibly the best comparison is it feels like Marvel vs. Capcom or Tatsunoko vs. Capcom on the Moon, in that walking is slow, falling is fast, but the game can reach dizzying speeds when attacks are strung into combos by skilled players. Melee is almost the inverse in that running and falling speed is increased, and attacks and dodges are slower. Most attacks and dodges are still pretty fast, but not quite as fast as the original. This is the other potential fastest, and many people love it. Melee also introduces air dodges, which made it slightly more difficult to get combos on a skilled player, and the lethal damage was raised slightly. Brawl manages to feel like the original in slow motion, with exaggeratedly slow movement, longer wind-up times before attacks, and absurd air time. Players who like heavy air games usually prefer Brawl, given how air combo focused it is. Brawl also introduced tripping and footstool jumps, which footstool jumps aren't bad, but are kinda pointless. Now, tripping was infuriating to nearly everybody, myself included. Smash Bros. 4 is famously Brawl, minus tripping with lessened wind-up times, faster movement, and less floating. I felt like Melee's movement was slightly too fast, Brawl was a little too slow-paced and luck-based, and Smash 4 had the best feel since the original. It's hard to say one of those two felt better. A compromise between Smash Bros. 4 and the original would probably be perfect for me. Each game is a different thing from the others, but if I had to pick favorites, they would have to be Smash Bros. 4, the original, Melee, and then Brawl. Episode question! Which Smash Bros. Is your favorite? Okay, flash time! Here's some defining characteristics of Mega Man, evaluating the original 12's safety. And something else. Oh. No. Oh, where is Weird Flat? Yeah.